Welcome back. Now that you've learned the different types of pro formas and how they're used, let's discuss some of their limitations. Unfortunately, this tool isn't perfect, it's merely an estimation. However, its value lies in presenting assumptions alongside your pro forma, clarifying the reasoning behind the figures. This shifts the conversation because the person you're speaking to won't dismiss your ideas as crazy right away. Instead, they'll grasp the specific reasons behind your point. They might pinpoint certain assumptions they disagree with or express doubts about, for example, your margin, but it allows for a more focused discussion and adjustments are possible to be made to create new outputs. Because performance relies on assumptions, there's a saying that's very common in my line of business: garbage in, garbage out. If you don't put the effort into testing and crowdsourcing and figuring out what your assumptions are going to be, the model might not be accurate. For example, if you have an assumption that you'll sell your product for double what your competitors are earning, you can't put any faith in the outputs of your pro forma. So, it's important to be conservative. It's important to qualify your assumptions and call out when you're talking to somebody about your pro forma if there's an assumption in there that's maybe a little loose. Maybe your lease rate isn't negotiated yet and you're still estimating that figure. You want to still put one in there that you think is realistic, but you still communicate that to somebody who's looking at investing in your business so that you can say, look, these are the assumptions that are strong, but these are the ones that are still working on getting a little bit more tightened up. If plans are a little in flux, they're going to understand that because nothing's perfect, especially when you're starting a business, and nothing is certain. That's why we use the term assumptions. Your pro forma is a living document. What this means is that it should be updated every month or every quarter. It should also be updated if your staffing costs go up or your margins change. You should gather historical data that's updated into the model at least every month or every quarter, since all of this might change how you interpret your forecast. So, one of the limitations here of pro formas is that they can be overly optimistic. In the beginning, when cannabis was just starting out on the West Coast and in other states, everybody's pro formas were not entirely set in reality because everything was still so new. So, data, information, and research was very scarce. Everybody in their pro formas was overstating the revenue potential of their businesses. Everybody believed they've got the best thing since sliced bread and that their business would be worth $1 billion. Good investors are wise to that. They've been through it and they're going to see right through those inflated numbers if they're in your pro forma. They'll think to themselves, this person's either trying to take advantage of me or they just don't know their business very well. Neither is good for you if you're trying to raise money. Being conservative in your assumptions is critical. It communicates to people that you know what you're talking about and you're prepared for the worst. Getting multiple sources for your assumptions is critical again. Always use a contingency. This means that you could build every cost you could possibly think of into your pro forma and then add another 20% onto that because you don't know which ones are going to go up and what unknown unknowns there will be. The unknown unknown is the biggest thing that you need to fear, especially if you aren't keeping a contingency fund. But that's the way that we remedy for things that are unforeseen. Imagine the unexpected happening. What if you have a break in and they rob you? What if, next month you're now behind because you have to go and raise money and now you're not in a great position because you didn't have that contingency fund put aside? A good contingency fund will help keep you afloat and keep the lights on for long enough to survive a business cycle. This could be anywhere from 3 to 12 months of cash on hand, depending on how consistent your cash flow is and how flexible your operations are. Another limitation is that pro formas can be very complex. You should ask a lot of questions and learn as much as you can to develop a comprehensive pro forma. There's tons of resources and tons of people to talk to in this business. Ask what their margins are. A couple people will be happy to tell you, and asking these types of questions to understand and inform your own pro forma is really critical. You do not want to work and shoot in the dark. Most entrepreneurs do not have years of experience building these types of economic models, and that's very normal. I've had clients who've been in their business for 20 or 30 years, and they still have a hard time wrapping their head around this stuff. So don't ever feel self conscious about that, and don't be afraid to engage an expert because the value is definitely there. When you see a pro forma model for the first time, it might look incredibly overwhelming. There's going to be a lot of data and a lot of cells. Usually it's an Excel model. You may or may not be familiar with that program, and that's okay. Asking questions is critical to learning this skill. There are also templates available via the internet or through working with technical assistance providers that could help out a lot. But at the end of the day, if you have a really good person that's helping build these models for you, they should be able to explain to you how to use them and update them yourselves so you don't need to keep going back and paying them every single month to make these simple updates. There's the complex part of building the models initially, which takes an expert and takes a lot of really detailed experience in the industry. And then there's the gradual updates that you'll do that don't take very long and should just reflect putting information into cells. And anyone with a basic Excel understanding should be able to do that as long as your person that you're working with can walk them through that process. So I've relayed a lot of information during this course, and some of these terms may be new to you. Few folks are comfortable talking about money, but when you're running a business, it is crucial to understand where your money is, how it's working, and where it's going. Let's go over a few tips to keep in mind. So, the first tip is that you want to make sure that your pro forma is realistic long term. This could include what percentage of the market you're projected to capture at your current margins. So, when I'm assessing somebody's model to see if it's good or not, one of the first things I'll look at is the gross margin. Gross margin is the difference between sales revenue and cost of goods sold. It shows how much money a business makes from selling its products before deducting other overhead expenses. If your gross margin is over 80%, for example, I don't believe you. That's a tremendously successful business. There's very few businesses in any industry that can deliver those types of gross margins. If it's, on the other hand, below 20%, I wouldn't want to invest in your business because I don't think it's going to survive. It's not enough margin to cover the operating costs that you're going to need to run that business. So, knowing these types of things and knowing where you fall on that scale is really critical. Saturation is another important concept to consider. Don't assume that your store is going to maintain its year one or year two revenues for 10 years. At a certain point in time, more licenses will be awarded if you're in a legal state. Regulations will change and evolve, and more operators are undoubtedly going to enter the space. Eventually, there will be a flow of competitors coming into your neighborhood, taking away your business because this industry is growing fast and more opportunities will arise. Market saturation occurs when the demand for a product or service is fully met within a specific market and further growth becomes challenging. And this means that the most potential customers already own or use the product or service, leaving little room for expansion unless new markets are targeted or the product or service is diversified in some type of way. In new cannabis markets, it would be realistic to show a growth in revenue, and then maybe there's a little bit of a decline until it balances out somewhere. This is not a technology company. You don't have an endless pool of people that you're selling to. You're not constantly raising money to cover your cash flow. You need to raise money once, maybe twice, and sustain on that. And so, what you need to be able to do is demonstrate to investors that you're thinking that far ahead into the future, and they will reward you for it because it will show that you know what you are talking about. Another tip is to make sure that the number of employees you have in your model is realistic for the size of your business and how many customers per day you might be having to service. Many companies will tend to overhire and overestimate the number of customers per day if, for example, you're running a retail store. One thing you can do to help mitigate this, if you have competitors in the area, is to do some research, scout out, see how many customers are coming through their store, and make some realistic assumptions about how many of those customers you might be able to divert to your location instead. One more time for good measure. These are living documents. Update them often. Investors know if a forecast is lofty. They see these models every single day. They're going to identify if there's an assumption in there that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and they will likely ask you about it. So you want to be conservative. And if you're going to build one of these models, you have to be able to qualify every assumption that you're putting into that pro forma. You don't need to be able to explain how the formulas all work. You don't need to be able to explain the technical mathematical details behind the model. That's what the expert's for. But you do need to be able to know why each assumption input has been put in there. And recognize that pro formas are confidential. I would not just advise sharing your pro forma with anyone. I would say typically you only want to show a small amount, like we talked about before, depending on exactly what that person needs to see. And don't show the whole thing to anyone unless they're about to stroke a check. Generally, show as much as you need and no more. So this wraps up the financial forecasting course. Remember, raising money is like running a marathon. It requires endurance, determination, and sometimes a little bit of humor to keep you going. So don't be intimidated by what you don't know. Every successful business starts with a learning curve. Mastering these tools will empower you to grow confidently in this dynamic industry. Thanks for joining. I'll see you in the next course.